The butterfly in the garden. A child stands at the edge of a garden where a butterfly lies motionless on the ground. Its wings, once bright with color, have faded to something dull and still. The child reaches down, touches it gently, and feels nothing move. Something has left. Something that was there moments ago. Something that made the wings flutter and the creature seek flowers and sunlight has simply vanished. The body remains, but whatever animated it has gone somewhere else or nowhere at all. This is often the first encounter with death, not through explanation or philosophy, but through the sudden absence of movement in something that moved. The goldfish floating at the surface of the bowl, the bird found beneath a window, the way a grandmother's hand feels different in those final hours, present but somehow already distant. These moments arrive without warning, and they leave behind a question that never fully disappears. What happens when the thing that makes us alive stops being there? Death is not a concept that arrives fully formed. It comes in pieces, in small revelations scattered across childhood and adolescence. The realization that pets do not live as long as people. The understanding that great-grandparents exist in photographs but not in rooms. The slow comprehension that everyone in those old pictures has become absence. And eventually the terrible clarity that this fate awaits everyone, including the person asking the question. The child standing over the butterfly cannot yet articulate what has been lost. There is no vocabulary for the difference between a living thing and the same thing no longer living. Adults offer words like passed away or gone to a better place. But these phrases feel like substitutions, like ways of speaking around the truth rather than toward it. The butterfly has not passed away. It has stopped, and where it has gone, if anywhere, remains the deepest mystery the child will ever face. From that first encounter, a peculiar kind of awareness begins to grow. Not constant, not always conscious, but present nonetheless. The knowledge that everything alive will one day become still. When death becomes personal, there is a moment, usually in adolescence or early adulthood, when the abstract idea of death becomes intensely personal. It is not the death of others that suddenly feels real, but the certainty of one's own ending. This realization often arrives late at night, lying in bed, when the mind has nowhere else to go. The body that feels so solid, so permanent, so unmistakably here, will one day cease to function. The thoughts happening right now will stop happening. The self that seems so continuous, so essential, will simply terminate. This awareness can bring a kind of vertigo. The future, which once stretched endlessly forward, suddenly has a boundary, somewhere ahead, in a year or decade or half-century, that cannot be known. This stream of consciousness will end. There will be a final thought, a last moment of awareness, and then something else, or nothing else. The uncertainty itself becomes overwhelming. Some people experience this realization with terror. The idea of non-existence feels impossible to grasp and unbearable to accept. How can the self, which is the only thing ever directly experienced, simply vanish? How can the world continue without the consciousness observing it? The prospect of eternal nothingness feels worse than any imaginable suffering, because suffering at least confirms existence. Oblivion offers nothing to hold on to, no consolation, no continuation. Others meet the same realization with a strange calm. If death means the end of consciousness, then it also means the end of fear, pain, and every form of suffering. There will be no one left to regret missed opportunities or mourn lost relationships. The self that worries about death will not exist to experience it. In this view, death is not a tragedy but a release, a return to the same state that existed before birth. If the billions of years before consciousness began caused no distress, why should the infinity after consciousness ends? But neither terror nor calm fully captures the complexity of knowing that death is coming. Because even when the mind accepts mortality intellectually, the body continues to resist it instinctively. Every reflex, every heartbeat, every breath contradicts the idea of ending. The organism wants to persist. And this tension between acceptance and resistance creates a strange background hum to existence, a quiet awareness that everything is temporary. From that awareness, a question begins to form. Not just what happens after death, but what death means for the time before it arrives. The shadow over everything. To live with the knowledge of death is to live with a shadow, not always visible, not always acknowledged, but present in the background of every decision and desire, the things people build, the relationships they form, the meanings they construct. All of these exist against the certainty of their own impermanence. A house will outlast its builder, but not forever. A child will carry a parent's memory, but not indefinitely. Every human project ends unfinished. Some philosophers have argued that death gives life its meaning. If existence stretched forever, if there were no deadline, no final moment, then perhaps nothing would matter. Choices could always be deferred. Relationships could always be repaired. The urgency that drives human action, the sense that time is limited and must be used wisely, comes directly from mortality. Without death, life might become an endless plateau, each day indistinguishable from the last, with no reason to prioritize one thing over another. But this argument feels incomplete, because while death may create urgency, it also creates futility. The novel written with such care will eventually be forgotten. The love given so freely will leave no trace once both lovers are gone. The civilization built over centuries will crumble. If everything ends in erasure, then why does any of it matter in the first place? The meaning that death supposedly creates seems to collapse under the weight of death itself. Perhaps meaning exists not in permanence but in the moment. The meal shared with friends does not need to last forever to be valuable. The conversation that brings clarity, the sunset that brings peace, the embrace that brings comfort, these experiences contain their own worth regardless of what comes after. They do not need to be eternal to be real. They do not need to be remembered to have mattered when they occurred. Still, there is something in human nature that resists this consolation. People want their lives to mean something beyond themselves. They want to leave marks that endure, and death, by erasing the individual who created those marks, seems to erase the marks themselves. The artist wants the painting to survive. The parent wants the child to remember. The writer wants the words to reach readers not yet born. But eventually there will be no one left who knew the artist, no descendant who carries the parent's voice, no reader who understands the writer's language. This is the paradox at the heart of mortality. Death makes life precious by making it finite, but it also makes everything ultimately meaningless by ensuring nothing lasts. And from this paradox, another question emerges. If death cannot be avoided, and if its finality cannot be escaped, then what should a person do with the time between birth and ending? The hidden process. The dying process itself remains largely hidden from those who have not experienced it. People die in hospitals, in hospice facilities, in bedrooms behind closed doors. The moment of transition from alive to dead happens mostly in private, witnessed by a small number of people who rarely speak in detail about what they saw. This creates a strange gap in human knowledge. Everyone will die, but almost no one knows what dying actually feels like. Those who have come close, who have been resuscitated after cardiac arrest or pulled back from the edge of fatal injury, sometimes describe the experience. There is often a sense of detachment, of observing the body from a distance rather than inhabiting it. Pain fades, fear diminishes. Some report a feeling of peace, of letting go, of surrendering to something larger than themselves. Others describe darkness, confusion, a sense of dissolution. But these accounts, while fascinating, cannot fully answer the question, because the people who return from near death have not actually died. They have approached the threshold but not crossed it. Whatever lies on the other side of that final boundary remains unknown to anyone still capable of speaking about it. The dead cannot report back, and so the living are left to imagine, to theorize, to hope, or fear based on incomplete information. Religious traditions offer detailed maps of what comes after: heaven and hell, reincarnation, reunion with ancestors, absorption into the divine. These visions provide comfort and structure, giving death a shape and meaning that pure oblivion does not. They transform death from an ending into a transition, from termination into transformation. The dying person is not vanishing, but moving to another realm, another form, another chance. Yet for those without religious certainty, these maps feel less like knowledge and more like wishes, beautiful, perhaps necessary, but ultimately unverifiable. The atheist or agnostic faces death without the promise of continuation, without the assurance that consciousness persists in any form. For them, dying means accepting that the self will dissolve completely, that memory and personality and every accumulated experience will simply cease to exist. This creates a profound loneliness, not just the loneliness of dying itself, which must be faced alone regardless of who stands at the bedside, but the loneliness of not knowing. Every other major experience in life can be prepared for through the testimony of others, but death offers no reliable witnesses, and so each person must approach it as the first person ever to die, without guidance, without certainty, without any clear sense of what is actually happening. From that loneliness, from that fundamental not knowing, certain questions begin to feel more urgent, not just what comes after, but what consciousness actually is and whether it can exist independently of the body that seems to produce it. Consciousness and the brain. The relationship between mind and brain remains one of science's deepest puzzles. Consciousness emerges from neural activity, from electrical signals passing through networks of cells, from chemical reactions in tissue that weighs about 3 pounds. Damage the brain, and consciousness changes. Remove certain regions, and specific abilities vanish. The self, which feels so unified and essential, appears to be constructed from purely physical processes. This suggests that when the brain dies, consciousness dies with it. No brain activity means no thoughts, no awareness, no experience of any kind. Death becomes a return to the state before birth, to the void from which consciousness briefly emerged. There is no afterlife because there is no mind left to experience it. The self is an illusion created by biology, and when biology fails, the illusion ends. But this explanation, while scientifically compelling, leaves something unresolved. Because consciousness does not feel like an illusion, it feels like the only thing that is real. The self may be constructed from neurons and chemistry, but the experience of being that self is undeniable. And if consciousness can emerge once from unconscious matter, from atoms arranged in particular patterns, then perhaps it can emerge again. Perhaps the specific configuration that creates a self is not unique, not singular, but repeatable. Some theorists suggest that consciousness is fundamental to the universe itself, not an accidental byproduct of evolution, but a basic feature of reality. In this view, awareness exists at all scales, from particles to planets, and what humans experience as individual consciousness is simply one localized manifestation of something universal. Death, then, would not extinguish consciousness, but would dissolve the boundaries that make it feel individual. The drop returns to the ocean. The wave subsides back into the sea. Others propose that consciousness might persist in forms not yet understood. Quantum theories, multiverse hypotheses, computational models of mind, all of these leave open possibilities that materialism alone cannot address. Perhaps consciousness exists independently of any single substrate. Perhaps it can transfer, migrate, or continue in patterns not visible to current science. But these are speculations, not answers. They offer hope without proof, possibility without certainty. And for the person facing death, they provide little concrete comfort. Because regardless of what consciousness might be in theory, the practical question remains. When this particular body stops functioning, when this specific brain ceases to generate thoughts, what happens to the self that is experiencing this moment right now? The materialist answer is clear and final. Nothing happens. The self simply ends. But the human need for continuation, for persistence, for meaning beyond mortality, resists this answer with everything it has. And from that resistance, religions and philosophies and entire civilizations have been built. The promise of heaven. Heaven appears in countless variations across human cultures, a garden of eternal peace, a city of light, a place of reunion with loved ones who died before, a realm where suffering ends and joy becomes permanent. The specifics differ, but the core promise remains the same. Death is not the end. The self continues, and not only continues but improves, transcends, becomes something better than what existed in mortal life. This vision addresses the deepest fears that death provokes: the fear of annihilation, the fear of separation, the fear that life's injustices will never be corrected. Heaven offers survival, reunion, and cosmic justice. The pain endured in life will be rewarded. The good that went unrecognized will be acknowledged. Those who suffered will find peace. Those who loved will be together again. For believers, this is not speculation but certainty. Death becomes a doorway, not a wall. The dying person is not ending but graduating, not disappearing but transforming. Grief remains, but it is softened by the belief that separation is temporary. The dead are not gone. They have simply moved ahead to a place the living will eventually reach. But for those without faith, heaven feels like wishful thinking. A beautiful story told to make death bearable, but ultimately a fiction. The desire for heaven proves nothing about its existence. The fact that people want to survive death does not mean they will, and the lack of any verifiable evidence for an afterlife suggests that consciousness really does end when the brain stops functioning. Yet even skeptics sometimes find themselves hoping, because the alternative, true oblivion, feels almost impossible to accept. Not just for oneself, but for others. The idea that a loved one has simply ceased to exist, that their personality and memories and everything that made them unique has dissolved into nothing, creates a grief so profound that the mind struggles to contain it. Heaven, even as a possibility, offers relief from that unbearable finality. This is why debates about the afterlife rarely resolve, because the question is not just intellectual but emotional, not just about evidence but about need. People believe what they must believe to keep living, and death, by its very nature, resists all attempts to verify or disprove what comes after. The only way to know is to die, and the dead do not speak. From this impasse, from the gap between what is known and what is hoped, certain compromises begin to emerge, ways of thinking about death that neither fully accept oblivion nor fully embrace religious certainty. The Wheel of Rebirth. The concept of reincarnation offers a different kind of continuation, not heaven, where the self persists in perfected form, but rebirth, where consciousness returns in a new body, a new life, a new chance. The details vary across traditions. Some describe a cycle of birth and death that repeats until enlightenment is achieved. Others suggest that souls move between bodies, carrying karma from one existence to the next, shaped by actions in previous lives. This vision changes the meaning of death. It becomes not an ending but a transition, not a permanent departure but a temporary pause. The self does not vanish, it transforms. The person who dies is not gone but reborn, their consciousness continuing in a form they cannot yet remember. And the life currently being lived is not the only one, not the final chance, but part of a larger journey spanning multiple existences. For those who believe in reincarnation, death loses some of its terror. If consciousness continues, if there are other lives ahead, then the failures and losses of this existence become less absolute. Missed opportunities will return. Relationships severed by death may be renewed in future incarnations. The injustices of one life can be balanced by the circumstances of another. But reincarnation also raises questions. If consciousness persists through multiple lives, then why can no one remember their previous existences? If the self continues but memory does not, then in what sense is it the same self? A person reborn without any recollection of who they were before might as well be a completely different individual. The continuation of consciousness without continuity of experience feels like a kind of death anyway. Some traditions address this by suggesting that memory is not truly lost but buried, accessible through meditation or spiritual practice. Others argue that forgetting is necessary, that each new life must begin fresh, unburdened by the accumulated weight of previous incarnations. The soul continues, but the personality resets. Only karma, the residue of past actions, carries forward to shape the conditions of the next existence. This creates a strange picture of identity. The person dying is not exactly ending, but they are also not exactly continuing. Some essence persists, but the self as currently experienced, with its specific memories and relationships and characteristics, will not return in the same form. It is continuation but not preservation, survival but not immortality. For those outside these traditions, reincarnation often feels no more verifiable than heaven. There are stories of children who claim to remember past lives, who describe places and people they could not have known through normal means. But these accounts remain contested, explained away by skeptics as coincidence or suggestion or fraud. The question of whether consciousness actually returns in new bodies remains unanswered, unprovable, a matter of faith rather than fact. And yet the idea persists across cultures and centuries, suggesting something deep in human psychology that refuses to accept that death is final. Not just a wish for personal survival, but a sense that consciousness itself is too strange, too fundamental, to simply vanish when a body fails. Dissolving into the infinite. Some religious traditions describe death not as continuation in another realm, but as absorption into something larger. The individual self, with its distinct personality and memories, dissolves back into the universal consciousness from which it emerged. Like a drop of water returning to the ocean, the boundaries that created separateness disappear, and what remains is no longer individual, but part of an infinite whole. This vision removes the terror of annihilation by suggesting that nothing is truly lost. The self does not vanish into nothingness but merges with everything. Personal identity may end, but consciousness itself continues, now experienced not from the limited perspective of a single being but from the totality of existence. Death becomes not extinction but expansion, not diminution but reunion with the source of all being. For those who embrace this view, dying is a homecoming. The separate self, which always felt incomplete and isolated, finally returns to unity. The distinction between self and other, between observer and observed, between mind and world, all of these dualities collapse. What emerges is not loss but wholeness, not ending but transformation into something vaster than any individual could contain. But this consolation requires giving up what most people value most. The personal self, with its specific loves and fears and experiences, must be relinquished. And while the idea of merging with infinite consciousness sounds beautiful in theory, in practice it means the end of everything that makes an individual who they are. Memories will not persist in universal awareness. Relationships will not continue in the cosmic whole. The person who dies will not experience reunion or recognition or anything resembling what they knew as life. This makes absorption feel, to some, like a gentler name for oblivion. If the self dissolves so completely that nothing recognizable remains, then what exactly has survived? The drop in the ocean is no longer a drop. It has become indistinguishable from every other drop, lost in the vastness, contributing to the whole, but possessing no individual existence. This is continuation only in the most abstract sense. Yet those who meditate deeply, who practice disciplines aimed at dissolving the ego and experiencing non-dual awareness, sometimes report glimpses of what this absorption might feel like. A sense of boundlessness, of being both nothing and everything, of consciousness without the usual center. In these moments, the fear of losing the self disappears, because the self is recognized as a construction, a temporary gathering of experience that was never as solid as it seemed. Whether these experiences reveal the true nature of death or simply demonstrate the plasticity of consciousness remains unclear. But they suggest that the relationship between individual and universal awareness might be more fluid than ordinary experience suggests. And they raise the possibility that death, rather than being the end of consciousness, might be its liberation from the limits of a single perspective. Near-death patterns. The scientific study of near-death experiences has revealed patterns that appear across cultures and backgrounds. People who have been clinically dead and then revived often describe similar phenomena: a sense of moving through a tunnel toward light, encounters with deceased loved ones, a life review where past actions and their consequences become vividly clear, a feeling of unconditional love or profound peace, and then, in most cases, a return to the body, often accompanied by disappointment at having to come back. These accounts are compelling and consistent enough to make even skeptics pause. If near-death experiences were purely random, produced by oxygen-deprived brains hallucinating without pattern, then the similarities across thousands of reports would be harder to explain. The fact that people from different religions, different eras, different levels of education describe such similar journeys suggests something systematic is happening at the threshold of death. Some researchers interpret these experiences as evidence of an afterlife, the consciousness that separates from the body, the encounters with the dead, the sense of moving toward another realm. All of these suggest that death is not the end but a transition. The consistency of the reports indicates that these are not random hallucinations, but glimpses of what actually lies beyond. Others offer neurological explanations. The tunnel and the light result from the way visual processing breaks down when the brain loses oxygen. The life review comes from memory systems activating in a final surge of neural activity. The sense of peace reflects endorphin release as the body shuts down. The encounters with loved ones are projections, wishful constructions of a dying mind seeking comfort in its final moments. Both interpretations fit the available data, but neither can be proven. The person who experiences a tunnel and light and then returns can never know whether they glimpsed an actual afterlife or whether their brain created a convincing simulation. The fact that they survived means they did not complete the journey. They turned back before reaching whatever lies at the end. This leaves the question unresolved. Near-death experiences may be previews of what comes after, or they may be elaborate illusions generated by failing biology. The people who have them often come away convinced that consciousness continues beyond death. But those who study them from the outside can just as easily conclude that they demonstrate how powerfully the brain can construct meaningful experiences even as it dies. What cannot be dismissed is the transformative effect these experiences have on those who undergo them. People who return from near death often lose their fear of dying. They describe death not as something to be avoided, but as a natural transition, even something to be welcomed when the time comes. Their priorities shift, material concerns fade, relationships deepen. They live differently because they have touched something that changed their understanding of what death means. Whether what they touched was real or neurological, transcendent or illusory, the impact remains undeniable. And perhaps that is what matters most. Not whether near-death experiences prove an afterlife exists, but whether they demonstrate that the fear of death can be overcome by those who approach it closely enough. The absence left behind. Grief arrives in the space left by someone who has died. Not just sadness, though sadness is part of it, but a particular kind of longing for presence that can no longer return. The chair they sat in remains empty, their voice is gone. The future that was supposed to include them now stretches ahead without their participation. And the person left behind must somehow continue living in a world that feels fundamentally changed by absence. The dead person has not gone somewhere else in any way that allows contact. They cannot be called or visited. They will not appear at the door. Every memory of them is now fixed, complete, never to be added to. The relationship that once grew and changed has become static. What was dynamic is now finished. And this finality, this absolute cut in the continuity of connection, creates a pain that nothing fully relieves. Some traditions encourage talking to the dead, maintaining relationships with them through prayer or ritual, or simply speaking aloud as if they can still hear. These practices provide comfort, a sense of ongoing connection, a way to include the deceased in current life, but they also highlight the fundamental change. The dead do not answer back, not in any voice that others can hear. The conversation has become one-sided, and the uncertainty about whether they are actually listening or whether they exist at all to listen, makes the practice both comforting and heartbreaking. Grief also carries guilt, things left unsaid, apologies not offered, love not expressed clearly enough while there was still time. The dying person becomes unavailable for repair, for reconciliation, for one more chance to make things right, and the living person must carry those unfinished pieces forward, knowing that the opportunity to resolve them has permanently closed. But grief is not only about loss, it is also evidence of love. The pain of someone's absence measures the value of their presence. To grieve deeply is to have loved fully, and while that does not make the pain easier to bear, it does give it meaning. The person who feels nothing when someone dies either never cared or has numbed themselves to caring. Grief, in its terrible way, confirms that the relationship mattered. Over time, grief changes. The sharp edges dull. The absence becomes familiar rather than shocking. Life reorganizes itself around the space left behind. But the loss never disappears. Years later, something small, a scent, or a phrase, or a particular quality of light, can bring the dead person vividly back to mind and reopen the wound. They remain gone, but they also remain somehow present, woven into memory, into the structure of the self that knew them. This is perhaps the closest thing to immortality that actually exists. Not heaven or reincarnation or cosmic absorption, but persistence in the minds of the living. As long as someone remembers, the dead are not entirely gone. Their influence continues, their words still echo. The way they shaped those who loved them remains part of the ongoing world. But eventually, everyone who remembered them will also die. And then, unless they left something in the wider culture, some work or contribution that outlasted personal memory, they will finally and completely vanish. The last person who knew them will pass, and with that passing, the dead will become truly and permanently lost. The pursuit of legacy. Some people become obsessed with leaving a legacy, with creating something that will outlast their physical existence. A work of art, a scientific discovery, a business, a building with their name on it. These projects are attempts to defeat death through achievement, to ensure that even when the body fails, some part of the self remains in the world, recognized, remembered, continuing to matter. But legacy is a fragile kind of immortality. Most names fade within a generation or two. The politician once considered essential becomes a footnote in history books that no one reads. The artist whose work filled galleries ends up in storage, forgotten by curators who have moved on to newer movements. The business built over decades gets absorbed by a larger corporation and loses even the founder's name. Time erases almost everything, and the few who do achieve lasting fame often become simplified, reduced to caricatures that bear little resemblance to who they actually were. Even those who achieve genuine historical permanence, whose names appear in every textbook, exist only as abstractions. Shakespeare is remembered, but not as a person. He is a collection of plays, a symbol of literary achievement, a name without interiority. No one knows what he actually thought, or felt, or feared. The works remain, but the self that created them has been dead for 4 centuries and will never return. This makes the pursuit of legacy feel, in some ways, like a denial of death rather than a victory over it. The person desperate to be remembered has not escaped mortality. They have simply tried to create a marker that will persist after they vanish. But the marker is not them. It does not experience. It does not think. It is only a trace, a shadow, a reminder that someone once existed but no longer does. Yet the impulse to leave something behind remains powerful, not necessarily for fame, but for meaning. The parent wants the child to remember them well. The teacher wants students to carry forward what was learned. The friend wants to have mattered in someone's life. These are not grandiose ambitions, but simple human desires. To have existed and to have made some small difference, to not disappear without trace. Perhaps this is enough, not immortality, not eternal recognition, but simply the knowledge that for a time, for the brief span of a human life, existence was shared with others and mattered to them. The impact may not last forever, but it was real while it occurred. And maybe reality does not require permanence to have value. Still, the fact that everything ends, that even the grandest legacy eventually crumbles, raises the question of whether anything has ultimate meaning. If time erases all accomplishments, if death claims every person no matter how significant, then what is the point of striving, building, caring about anything beyond immediate experience? This is the question that mortality forces every reflective person to confront, and the answers, when they come, tend to be personal rather than universal. The shift toward acceptance. The acceptance of death, when it arrives, often comes not through philosophy but through exhaustion. The body worn down by age or illness simply stops resisting. The will to continue, which once felt indestructible, begins to fade, and what seemed unbearable, the prospect of no longer existing, starts to feel like rest, not a defeat but a release. Those who work with the dying describe a shift that happens in the final days or weeks. The person stops fighting, they stop talking about recovery, stop making plans for a future that will not arrive. They begin to say goodbye, to let go of relationships and concerns that once felt essential. There is often a clarity in these moments, a peacefulness that surprises those who expected only fear and struggle. This acceptance is not resignation. It is something deeper, a recognition that death is not an enemy to be defeated, but a natural conclusion to the process of living. The tree drops its leaves in autumn, not because it has been defeated by the cold, but because the season has come for dropping leaves. And in the same way, the dying person releases the effort of staying alive when the time for release has arrived. But this acceptance does not come easily or early. It arrives only after everything else has been tried and exhausted. The person must first move through denial, through anger at the unfairness, through bargaining for more time, through depression at what is being lost. Only then, when all other responses have run their course, does acceptance become possible. For those watching, the transformation can be both comforting and unsettling. Comforting because the dying person seems at peace, no longer suffering the terror of what is coming. Unsettling because that peace feels like the beginning of absence, the first stage of departure. The person is still present, still breathing, but something essential has already started to withdraw. What happens in consciousness during those final moments remains unknown. Does awareness simply fade, like falling asleep, until there is nothing left to experience? Or is there some final clarity, some last surge of perception before everything stops? The accounts from those who have been resuscitated suggest that dying might be less frightening than the living imagine. But these accounts cannot be verified by those who complete the journey. All that can be known is what is observed from the outside, the breathing that becomes irregular, then shallow, then stops, the pulse that weakens and disappears, the body that changes from living to dead, from warm to cool, from animate to still. The exact moment when life ends is often difficult to pinpoint. There is no clear line, only a gradual transition from one state to another. And in that transition, something that cannot be weighed or measured or detected by any instrument simply ceases. The person is gone. Whatever made them who they were, whatever allowed them to think and feel and experience the world, has stopped occurring. And those left behind must somehow make sense of the fact that someone who was fully present a moment ago has become irretrievably absent. The peculiar silence. The moment after death brings a peculiar kind of silence. The person who was breathing is now still. The room, which moments ago contained a living presence, now contains only a body, and those who remain must confront the strange truth that the dead person is both there and not there. The physical form persists, but the animating consciousness has departed. What remains is a shell, a vessel that once held something but is now empty. Different cultures have different ways of responding to this moment. Some wash and prepare the body with great care, treating it as sacred even though the person has gone. Others remove it quickly, preferring not to linger in the presence of death. Some sit with the dead for hours or days, maintaining vigil, speaking to them as if they can still hear. Others find the stillness unbearable and leave as soon as possible. But regardless of custom or belief, the moment forces a recognition that cannot be avoided. Death has occurred. The person will not return. And the relationship that existed between the living and the dead has fundamentally changed. No longer a mutual exchange, but a one-way remembering. No longer a present connection, but a memory of what was. The body itself becomes a problem. It will decay. It must be dealt with. Burial, cremation, donation to science. Each option represents a different way of handling the physical remains. But none of these choices affects what has actually been lost. The body was never the person. It was only the form the person inhabited. And now that the inhabitant has departed, the form becomes almost irrelevant, a leftover that must be disposed of with respect, but also with practicality. Some people find comfort in funeral rituals, in gathering to acknowledge the death and share grief. These ceremonies provide structure for emotions that might otherwise feel overwhelming. They mark the transition from life to death, from presence to memory. They give permission to mourn publicly, to express loss in ways that daily life does not allow. Others find rituals hollow, performative, a way of avoiding the raw reality of death rather than facing it. For them, the formal speeches and prescribed prayers feel disconnected from the actual person who died, reducing a unique individual to generic platitudes about rest and peace and better places. The funeral becomes theater, a show for the living rather than an honoring of the dead. But whether rituals help or hinder, they cannot change what death has done. The person is gone, and the question of where they have gone, if anywhere, remains unanswered. The religious offer their certainties: heaven, paradise, reunion with God. The skeptical offer their own certainty: nowhere, nothing, the simple cessation of consciousness. And those in between, uncertain, hoping but not convinced, are left in the space where belief and doubt coexist without resolution. Explaining death to children. Children ask the most direct questions about death. Where did grandma go? Will I die too? What happens when you die? Adults often struggle to answer, caught between the desire to protect the child from fear and the need to speak truthfully. The explanations offered: she is in heaven, she is sleeping, she has become a star, are gentle lies meant to soften what feels too harsh to say plainly. She has ceased to exist. You will too. Everyone does. But children often sense the evasion. They know that sleep is temporary and heaven is uncertain and stars are not people. They know that something irreversible has happened, that the person who was here is no longer here, and that the adults around them are uncomfortable with the truth. This discomfort teaches its own lesson. Death is something that cannot be spoken about directly, something that requires euphemism and softening, something too terrible to face clearly. Some argue that this dishonesty is necessary, that children are not developmentally ready to confront mortality in its full reality. Others believe that children can handle truth better than adults assume, that what frightens them is not death itself, but the fear and discomfort they see in adults trying to explain it. A clear, calm acknowledgement of death as a natural part of life might be less disturbing than vague reassurances that do not quite make sense. What children need most, perhaps, is not a definitive answer to what happens after death, but permission to ask the question. They need adults who will sit with their uncertainty rather than dismissing it, who will acknowledge that death is confusing and sad and strange without pretending to have all the answers, who will let them feel their feelings without rushing to make those feelings go away. Because the question of what comes after death is not one that adults have solved. The child asking where grandma went deserves honesty about that uncertainty. She might be in heaven, she might be nowhere. We do not know. What we do know is that she is not here anymore, and we miss her, and it is okay to feel sad about that. This kind of honesty requires adults to confront their own uncertainty, to admit that they do not have the answers they wish they had. And that can be difficult, because part of being an adult is supposed to be knowing things, having explanations, being able to guide children through confusion. But death resists explanation. And pretending otherwise teaches children that some questions must not be asked, some truths must not be spoken. From these early lessons about what can and cannot be said, children begin to form their own relationship with mortality. Some become preoccupied with it, anxious about death in ways that interfere with living. Others push it away entirely, refusing to think about it until life forces the confrontation. And a few, somehow, develop an ease with impermanence, an ability to hold the fact of death alongside the experience of life without letting one destroy the other. The diagnosis that changes everything. The diagnosis of a terminal illness changes everything instantly. One moment, the future stretches forward with the usual uncertainties. The next, it has been cut short, reduced to months or weeks instead of years or decades. The person receiving the news must suddenly recalibrate their entire existence around the fact of approaching death. Everything that felt permanent becomes temporary. Every plan becomes provisional. Some people respond with fierce determination to fight, to pursue every treatment, to squeeze every possible day out of the time remaining. They refuse to accept the prognosis, insisting that statistics do not apply to individuals, that exceptions exist, that hope is always reasonable. And sometimes they are right. Sometimes the body defies expectations, but more often, the fight only postpones the inevitable while adding suffering to the process. Others choose a different path. They accept the timeline, however brutal, and focus not on prolonging life, but on shaping the time that remains. They decide what matters most, what they want to experience, who they need to see. They say the things that need to be said. They make peace where peace is possible. And when the end comes, they meet it with clarity rather than denial. Neither approach is superior. Each person must face death in the way that makes sense for their values, their temperament, their circumstances. The fighter who refuses to surrender and the acceptor who releases the struggle are both responding to the same terrible situation with the resources they have. And judgment from those not facing the same fate has no place in these decisions. What does become clear in terminal illness is how unprepared most people are for their own mortality. Even though death is certain from birth, most people live as though it will never actually arrive. They delay important conversations. They assume there will always be time later. And then the diagnosis comes, and suddenly there is no more later, only now. And now is filled with regret for time wasted, words unspoken, experiences never pursued. This awareness, while painful, can also bring clarity. When the future is short, the present becomes vivid. Small pleasures take on significance. The taste of food, the warmth of sunlight, the presence of loved ones, all of these become precious in a way they were not when life felt unlimited. Terminal illness teaches, in the cruelest way possible, that life is valuable precisely because it is finite. But this lesson comes too late for most. By the time the diagnosis arrives, the body is often too compromised to do the things that might have been done earlier. The trip that was always planned for someday cannot be taken. The book that was meant to be written will not be finished. The relationship that needed repair has run out of time for healing, and the dying person must let go of all these uncompleted possibilities and find some way to accept that what was done will have to be enough. When pain makes death welcome. Pain changes the relationship with death. When suffering becomes constant, when every day brings fresh agony, death can begin to look like mercy. Not suicide, not an active ending, but simply the natural conclusion to a body that has reached the limits of what it can endure. The person in pain does not want to die, exactly, but they want the pain to stop, and death is the only guarantee that it will. This creates a complicated moral landscape. Loved ones want the person to live, to fight, to hold on, but they also want the suffering to end. They watch someone they care about endure indignities and agonies that no one should have to bear, and they begin to wonder whether continuing life at such a cost is actually kindness or whether it is prolonging torment for the sake of the living rather than the dying. Palliative care offers some relief: medications that manage pain, therapies that ease symptoms, support that addresses emotional and spiritual distress. These interventions can make the final weeks or months bearable, allowing the person to maintain dignity and connection even as the body fails. But palliative care cannot eliminate all suffering, and some people reach a point where they simply want the process to be over. The question of assisted death, of allowing terminally ill people to choose the timing and manner of their own ending, divides communities and legislatures. Those who support it argue that autonomy extends to the moment of death, that competent adults should have the right to end unbearable suffering on their own terms. Those who oppose it worry about coercion, about vulnerable people being pressured to die to avoid being burdens, about the sanctity of life being diminished. Both positions come from genuine ethical concern, and both struggle with the reality that death, when it finally arrives, is often neither peaceful nor dignified. The idealized vision of passing quietly in sleep, surrounded by loved ones, happens far less often than the messy, protracted, painful process of systems shutting down one by one while consciousness lingers in a body that no longer functions properly. What almost everyone agrees on is that suffering at the end of life should be minimized as much as possible, whether that means aggressive pain management, hospice care, spiritual support, or, in some jurisdictions, the option to hasten death when suffering becomes unendurable. The dying person deserves compassion, respect, and whatever comfort can be offered as they approach the unknown. But comfort cannot answer the deeper question: what comes after the pain stops? What happens when consciousness finally releases its grip on the failing body? Whether there is anything at all on the other side of that final letting go. The fear of eternal punishment. The fear of hell has shaped countless lives across centuries, not just the medieval tortures depicted in paintings, fire and demons and eternal suffering, but the more abstract terror of divine judgment, of being weighed and found wanting, of facing consequences that never end for mistakes that were only human. This fear has driven people to rigid moral codes, to self-denial, to desperate attempts to secure salvation before death makes repentance impossible. For those raised in traditions that emphasize hell, the prospect of dying becomes not just the end of life, but the beginning of potential torment. Every sin committed, every rule broken, every thought that violated doctrine becomes evidence that might condemn, and the deathbed becomes a last chance to confess, to repent, to somehow tip the scales back toward mercy before judgment arrives. But this fear also raises questions about the nature of any God who would create such a system. What kind of divine justice punishes finite crimes with infinite suffering? What kind of love threatens eternal torture for those who fail to believe correctly or behave perfectly? The concept of hell, when examined closely, seems less like justice and more like cruelty, less like the judgment of a benevolent creator and more like a tool of control designed to enforce obedience through terror. Some religious thinkers have tried to soften hell, to reimagine it as separation from God rather than literal torture, as a state of spiritual emptiness rather than physical pain. Others have proposed that hell is temporary, that eventually all souls will be reconciled and redeemed, and some have rejected the concept entirely, arguing that a truly loving God would not create conscious beings only to condemn them to eternal agony. For the atheist or agnostic, hell is simply a myth, a story used to frighten people into compliance with religious authority. There is no afterlife, no judgment, no cosmic punishment for earthly behavior. Death brings only the same nothingness that existed before birth. And while that may be bleak, it is also a kind of mercy. No eternal suffering, no divine retribution, just an ending, clean and final. But even for those who intellectually reject hell, the fear can linger. Cultural conditioning runs deep. The person raised with fire and brimstone sermons may logically dismiss the concept, while still feeling a visceral terror when death approaches. What if they are wrong? What if hell is real after all? What if the moment of death brings not oblivion but judgment, and the judgment condemns? This is Pascal's wager in its most anxious form. Better to believe, just in case, than to risk eternal punishment for disbelief. But this kind of faith, born from fear rather than conviction, feels hollow. It is not belief but hedging, not devotion but insurance. And whether a God who demands genuine faith would accept such calculated compliance remains doubtful. The final clarity, the moment when someone realizes they are actually dying, not someday in the abstract future, but soon, now, within hours or days, brings a quality of awareness that cannot be replicated. Everything becomes immediate. The concerns that filled yesterday, the worries about career or reputation or possessions, shrink to insignificance. What matters becomes startlingly clear: the people present, the comfort of familiar surroundings, the absence of pain, the desire for peace. This clarity is one of the strange gifts that terminal awareness can bring. Not the diagnosis itself, which is only loss, but the stripping away of everything inessential that happens when time becomes visibly limited. The dying person often knows exactly what they need, not false reassurance, not denial, just presence, honest words, permission to let go when the time comes. Loved ones often struggle with this clarity. They want to offer hope, to talk about treatments that might still work, to avoid acknowledging what is happening. But the dying person has moved past hope into a different kind of understanding. They know the body is failing. They feel it from the inside. And what they need is not optimism, but companionship in facing the truth. Some of the most profound moments between people happen in these final days. Things that could never be said before, vulnerabilities that could never be shown, suddenly become possible. The dying person has nothing left to protect. The illusions that sustained social interaction fall away, and what remains is naked humanity, fear and love and grief tangled together, expressed with a directness that ordinary life does not allow. But these moments also contain immense sadness, because the clarity arrives too late. All the years when honesty might have deepened relationships were spent maintaining pretenses, avoiding difficult conversations, keeping certain things unsaid. And now, when truth finally emerges, there is barely any time left to live in it. The dying person must also face the practical work of letting go, not just of life itself, but of responsibilities, relationships, the sense of being needed. The parent must release children into a future they will not see. The spouse must imagine a partner moving forward without them. The person who took care of everything must accept that others will manage, somehow, after they are gone. This letting go requires a kind of trust that runs counter to every instinct. The instinct to protect, to provide, to remain essential. But death demands surrender. The dying person cannot stay to see how things turn out. They cannot fix what remains broken or ensure that those left behind will be okay. They can only release their grip and hope that the world will continue, however differently, without them. And in that release, if it can be achieved, there is sometimes a final peace. Not happiness, because there is too much being lost for happiness, but a kind of acceptance. The work of living is almost done. The struggle to maintain consciousness in a failing body will soon end, and whatever comes next, whether something or nothing, will finally answer the question that has haunted human existence from the beginning. The atheist's loneliness. The atheist facing death confronts a particular loneliness. There is no comforting narrative to fall back on, no promise of reunion in another realm, no sense that consciousness continues in any form. Death means exactly what it appears to mean: the complete and permanent ending of the self. And this ending must be faced without the consolations that religious belief provides. For some atheists, this is not a source of fear but of clarity. If death is final, if there is no afterlife to prepare for, then the only life that matters is this one. Every moment becomes precious because it is unrepeatable. Every relationship becomes essential because it will not continue beyond death. The absence of an eternal future makes the present infinitely valuable. But this clarity does not eliminate grief. The atheist saying goodbye to someone they love feels the same crushing loss as the believer, perhaps even more because there is no expectation of seeing them again. The relationship is ending forever. The person will not be waiting in heaven. They will not be reborn. They have simply ceased to exist. And that finality, that absolute cut, creates a grief without consolation. Atheists sometimes envy believers their certainty, even while rejecting the beliefs themselves. It must be easier to face death believing it is only a transition. It must be comforting to imagine loved ones watching from somewhere beyond, still present in some form. But these comforts require faith, and faith cannot be manufactured by desire alone. The person who sees no evidence for an afterlife cannot simply choose to believe because belief would make death easier. What atheism offers instead is honesty, an unflinching acknowledgement that death is exactly as permanent as it appears. No wishful thinking, no comforting myths, just the simple truth that consciousness ends when the brain stops functioning. This truth is harsh, but it is also clean. There is no need to reconcile suffering with divine benevolence, no need to make sense of why a loving God allows terrible things. The universe is indifferent, death is natural, and meaning must be created by the living because it will not be provided by any external source. Some atheists find this liberating. Without the pressure of divine judgment or the promise of eternal consequences, they are free to define their own values, to create their own meaning, to live according to what feels right rather than what doctrine demands. The absence of afterlife removes both the threat of hell and the promise of heaven, leaving only the responsibility to make this life as good as possible while it lasts. But liberation and loneliness are not opposites, they coexist. The atheist is free from religious constraints but also unmoored from religious comfort. They face death without the assurance that something comes after, and in those final moments, when consciousness begins to fade, there is only the unknown, not the unknown of heaven or reincarnation or cosmic unity, just the unknown of what it means for awareness to stop. When memory fails before the body, memory begins to fail long before the body does. Names disappear first, then faces, then entire chapters of life. The person who once remembered everything with clarity finds themselves grasping for words that will not come, for events that have dissolved into fog, and eventually the self itself becomes uncertain. Who am I? Where am I? What year is this? The questions that have obvious answers for most people become mysteries to the mind, losing its grip on continuity. This dissolution of memory raises disturbing questions about identity. If the self is constructed from the accumulated experiences of a lifetime, then what happens when those experiences become inaccessible? Is the person with severe dementia still the same person they were before the disease? Or has that person already died, leaving behind a body that continues to breathe but no longer contains the consciousness that once inhabited it? Families watching a loved one fade into dementia often describe a kind of living grief. The person is still physically present, but the personality that made them who they were has vanished. They do not recognize their own children. They cannot remember their own history. They exist in a permanent present, disconnected from the past that shaped them and unable to imagine a future. In some sense, they have already left, even though their body has not yet died. This creates ethical dilemmas that have no clear answers. If the person has already lost the self that made them who they were, what obligation do others have to keep the body alive? If consciousness has fragmented beyond recognition, is continued existence actually in that person's interest? Or is it only prolonging suffering for the sake of those who cannot let go? Some argue that life has inherent value regardless of cognitive function, that the person with dementia deserves care and dignity even if they cannot remember who they are. Others suggest that quality of life matters more than mere biological persistence, that a life without awareness or connection or any capacity for experience is not really life in any meaningful sense. But these philosophical debates often feel abstract when compared to the actual experience of watching someone disappear piece by piece. The person caring for a parent or spouse with dementia is not weighing ethical principles. They are simply trying to get through each day, to provide comfort to someone who may not recognize them, to honor a relationship that has become one-sided. And they are also confronting their own mortality, because what happens to one person can happen to anyone. The mind that feels so solid, so reliable, so essentially oneself, is only as stable as the tissue that produces it. Damage that tissue, and the self unravels. Memory fails. Personality changes. The continuity that makes identity possible dissolves. And what remains is not the person who once existed, but a fragment, a remnant, a body that outlives the consciousness it was supposed to contain. This is perhaps the cruelest thing about human mortality. Not just that death comes, but that the self can disintegrate before death arrives, leaving those who loved that person to mourn someone who is still technically alive. What makes a life worth living? The question of what makes a life worth living becomes urgent when death approaches. Not in the abstract, not as a philosophical exercise, but as a practical matter requiring immediate judgment. The person with limited time must decide how to use what remains, what is essential, what can be released, what needs to happen before the ending arrives. For some, meaning comes from completion, finishing the book that has occupied years of effort, seeing a child married, reaching a particular birthday or anniversary. These goals provide structure, a sense of purpose that makes the diminishing time feel directed rather than simply running out. As long as there is something specific to achieve, death can be held at a distance, kept waiting until the task is done. Others find meaning not in completion but in presence. They stop trying to accomplish anything and focus instead on simply being with the people they love. Conversations that have no agenda, silences that require no filling, the experience of being together without the pressure of doing anything productive. Time measured not by achievements, but by quality of attention. Both approaches are valid. The person who needs to finish their work and the person who needs to stop working and simply be present are both responding to mortality in ways that honor their values. What matters is not the choice itself, but that the choice is made consciously, that the person facing death gets to decide what their final days or weeks or months will emphasize. But these choices assume a kind of clarity and autonomy that death does not always allow. The person who deteriorates slowly, whose mind fails before their body, may not have the capacity to make conscious choices about meaning. And the person who dies suddenly, in an accident or unexpected medical crisis, gets no time to reflect on what mattered most. Their life simply stops, mid-sentence, leaving others to make sense of an ending that arrived without warning or preparation. This randomness, this lack of guarantee that death will come in a way that allows for conscious conclusion, is part of what makes mortality so difficult to accept. People want control over their own endings. They want the chance to say goodbye properly, to resolve what needs resolving, to find some kind of peace with what their life amounted to. But death does not owe anyone that courtesy. It arrives when it arrives, in whatever form it chooses, and the person dying must simply cope with whatever circumstances they are given. Still, even in the absence of control, there is sometimes grace. The person who thought they needed completion discovers that release feels better than achievement. The person who wanted more time finds that the time they have is sufficient. The fear that dominated their thinking about death turns out to be less overwhelming than anticipated when death actually arrives. Not because death is easy, but because the capacity to endure it, to meet it with whatever dignity can be managed, often exceeds what people believe they possess. The ideal and the real. The concept of a good death has occupied philosophers, physicians, and ordinary people for millennia. What makes one death better than another? What circumstances allow someone to die well rather than badly? The answers vary across cultures and individuals, but certain themes recur: minimal suffering, awareness and acceptance, the presence of loved ones, a sense of completion or peace. But the ideal good death often conflicts with medical reality. Prolonged treatment that extends life also extends suffering. Consciousness, which seems necessary for saying goodbye, also means being aware of what is being lost. The desire to die at home surrounded by family may be impossible if constant medical intervention is required. And the sense of completion depends on having enough time and clarity to achieve it, which terminal illness does not always provide. Modern medicine has made death both better and worse. Better because pain can be managed more effectively, because some diseases that once killed quickly can now be survived, because people live longer and healthier lives than ever before. Worse because the extension of life sometimes means the extension of dying, because technology can keep the body functioning long after quality of life has vanished, because the line between healing and prolonging suffering has become unclear. This has created situations that previous generations never faced. The person kept alive by machines who would have died naturally within days. The patient who receives treatment after treatment, each one more invasive and less effective because stopping feels like giving up. The family forced to make decisions about life support for someone who left no clear instructions about what they would want. These decisions are agonizing because they require guessing what the dying person would choose if they could still communicate, and often there is no clear answer. The person who once said they would never want to be kept alive by machines might feel differently when actually facing death. The person who advocated for every possible intervention might reconsider when suffering becomes unbearable. What someone wants in the abstract can differ dramatically from what they want when the situation becomes real. The concept of a good death also assumes that death can be controlled, shaped, made to conform to preferences, but death often resists these attempts. It arrives messily, painfully, in ways that no one would choose. The final moments are not peaceful but confused. The body does not shut down gracefully but struggles, gasps, convulses. The consciousness that was supposed to remain clear until the end fragments into delirium. This gap between the idealized good death and the messy reality creates disappointment and guilt. Families feel they failed the dying person because the ending did not match the vision. The person who promised to stay conscious and calm finds themselves terrified and incoherent. The peaceful passing at home becomes a chaotic emergency transfer to the hospital. Perhaps the standard for a good death needs adjustment, not perfection. Not the idealized scenario, but simply the best that could be managed given the circumstances. Suffering minimized as much as possible. Dignity preserved where it could be. Love expressed, even if not perfectly. And forgiveness for the ways that death refused to cooperate with anyone's preferences. Rituals for the departed. Cultures around the world have developed elaborate rituals for honoring the dead. Wakes and funerals, memorial services, annual remembrances. These ceremonies serve multiple functions. They mark the transition from life to death. They provide structure for grief. They create public acknowledgement of loss. And they reinforce communal bonds by gathering people who share the experience of having known someone who is now gone. But rituals can also feel empty, especially for those who do not share the cultural or religious beliefs that give them meaning. The prescribed prayers, the formal eulogies, the symbolic gestures, all of these can feel like theater, like performances that have no connection to the actual person who died. The unique individual gets reduced to generic platitudes about rest and peace. Their complexity disappears into standardized language that could apply to anyone. Some families try to personalize rituals to make funerals reflect the specific person being mourned. They play music the person loved, display photographs from throughout their life, invite friends to share unscripted memories. These efforts can bring genuine comfort, creating space for the messy, contradictory, fully human person to be remembered rather than sanitized into a saint or reduced to a stereotype. Other people reject traditional rituals entirely, preferring informal gatherings or private mourning. They do not want the structure, the formality, the public performance of grief. They want to process loss in their own way, without the pressure to conform to cultural expectations about how the dead should be honored. Neither approach is wrong. Ritual provides comfort for some and constraint for others. What matters is that those who are grieving get to choose how they mark the death, how they say goodbye, how they begin the work of learning to live with absence. But regardless of how the dead are honored, the rituals themselves cannot answer the deeper questions. Where has the person actually gone? Do they still exist in some form? Can they somehow know that they are being remembered? The ceremony unfolds as if these questions have answers, as if the dead are watching from somewhere, aware of the tribute being paid. But this is projection, hope, the need to believe that the ritual reaches the person it is meant to honor. The truth is more uncertain. The dead, if they exist at all, do not exist in any form that allows them to witness their own funerals. They cannot see who came, who cried, who spoke with love, and who stayed silent. The ritual is for the living, not the dead. It provides closure for those who remain, not for the person who has departed. This realization can feel bleak. The impulse to honor the dead comes from love, from the desire to do something for them even after they are gone. But if they no longer exist to receive the honor, then what is the point? Who is the ritual actually serving? Perhaps the answer is simpler than it seems. The ritual serves those who grieve. It gives them a structured way to express love that has nowhere else to go. It acknowledges that the relationship mattered, that the person will be missed, that the world has been changed by their absence. And even if the dead cannot know they are being honored, the living need to honor them anyway, not for the sake of the dead but for their own sake, to mark the significance of what has been lost. The child who loses a parent. Children who lose a parent early carry a particular kind of absence through the rest of their lives. Not just the loss of a specific person, though that is devastating enough, but the loss of what that person would have provided over time: guidance during adolescence, support through early adulthood, presence at weddings, at the birth of grandchildren, the accumulation of shared experiences that never happens because one person is gone. The child grows up with a hole where a parent should be. Others try to fill it, and sometimes they succeed partially, but the original is irreplaceable. And as the child ages, the loss changes shape. The 5-year-old who lost a mother grieves differently than the 15-year-old version of that same child, who grieves differently than the adult they become. The loss is carried forward, evolving, never fully resolved. What makes this particularly painful is the way memory degrades over time. The young child who loses a parent has only a few years of actual experience with them, and those memories, vivid at first, begin to fade. The sound of the parent's voice disappears. The details of their face become uncertain. What remains are fragments, stories told by others, photographs that capture moments but not the felt reality of presence. Eventually, the child knows their dead parent more through absence than through memory. They know what was missed more clearly than what was experienced, and this creates a strange kind of grief, mourning not just what was lost, but what was never had, all the years of relationship that death prevented from occurring. The parent who dies leaves behind not just a child who misses them, but a child who must grow up fundamentally altered by loss. Research shows that early parental death affects development in lasting ways: increased anxiety, difficulty with attachment, a heightened awareness of mortality that peers do not share. These effects are not destiny, not guarantees, but they are tendencies that shape how the child moves through life. And yet, many children who lose parents early also develop resilience, empathy, depth of understanding that might not have emerged without loss. They know suffering in ways that make them more compassionate toward others who suffer. They understand fragility, impermanence, the importance of not taking relationships for granted. The loss shapes them, but it does not only diminish them, it also, in complex ways, deepens them. This is not to romanticize early parental death or suggest that the benefits outweigh the costs. They do not. The child would almost always prefer to have their parent alive. But since that choice is not available, since death has already occurred, the question becomes how the child carries the loss forward, whether they let it define them entirely or whether they find ways to integrate it into a life that also contains joy, connection, meaning. The answer varies for each child. Some are crushed by early loss and never fully recover. Others find ways to honor the dead parent by living well, by becoming people the parent would have been proud of. And some do both, carrying both crushing grief and determined resilience, both the wound and the strength that develops around it. Death without warning. Sudden death, the kind that arrives without warning, creates a different kind of grief than slow decline. There is no time to prepare, no chance to say goodbye, no gradual adjustment to the idea of loss. One moment the person exists, the next they are gone, and those left behind must somehow absorb the shock of that instantaneous transition. The car accident that kills in seconds, the heart attack that strikes without symptoms, the aneurysm that ruptures unexpectedly. These deaths do not allow for deathbed conversations or final reconciliations. They leave relationships frozen in whatever state they were in at the moment of death, arguments unresolved, apologies not offered, love not expressed. This creates a particular agony for survivors, the conversation that will now never happen, the thing that needed to be said but was put off because there seemed to be time, the assumption that tomorrow would provide another chance. When tomorrow turned out to be too late, the person left behind must live with these incompletions, knowing that repair is now permanently impossible. Sudden death also denies the dying person agency over their own ending. They do not get to prepare, to say goodbye, to make peace with mortality. Their life simply stops, mid-action, leaving behind unfinished business and unrealized plans. The book half-written, the project almost complete, the relationship just beginning to deepen, all of it cut off without warning or conclusion. For some, this is actually a mercy. Better to die instantly than to endure months of slow decline. Better to live fully until the very end than to spend the final phase of life in hospitals and diminished capacity. Sudden death means never having to consciously face mortality, never having to feel the body failing, never having to say goodbye knowing it is goodbye. But for those left behind, the lack of preparation makes grief harder to process. There is no gradual adjustment, no time to begin accepting the loss while the person is still alive. The transition from presence to absence is instantaneous and total, and the mind struggles to catch up with what has happened, continues expecting the person to walk through the door, to answer the phone, to be reachable somehow even though they are irrevocably gone. Sudden death also raises questions about fairness that slow decline does not. Why this person? Why now? What did they do to deserve having their life cut short without warning? The randomness feels cruel, meaningless, intolerable, and yet it must be tolerated because it has already happened and cannot be undone. Some people find eventual acceptance by embracing that randomness, by acknowledging that death does not operate on principles of fairness. It simply occurs to young and old, prepared and unprepared, without regard for who deserves it or when it should rightfully arrive. This perspective does not make the loss easier, but it stops the mind from torturing itself with unanswerable questions about why. Others never fully accept it. The sudden loss remains a wound that does not heal, a wrongness that cannot be reconciled. They carry it forward, not as something integrated into their understanding of life, but as a permanent scar, a place where the world broke in a way that should not have been possible. Do animals understand? The question of whether animals understand death has no definitive answer, but observation suggests they do, at least partially. Elephants return to the bones of deceased family members, touching them gently with their trunks. Chimpanzees have been seen carrying dead infants for days, refusing to release the body. Dogs sometimes refuse to leave the grave of a deceased owner. These behaviors suggest something beyond simple confusion, some recognition that death has occurred and that it matters. What animals likely do not have is the abstract understanding of mortality that humans possess. They may recognize that a specific individual has died, but they probably do not contemplate their own eventual death. They do not lie awake at night confronting the certainty of personal extinction. They do not build philosophies or religions to make sense of impermanence. They simply live until they die, without the burden of knowing in advance that death is coming. This might be a kind of mercy. The awareness of mortality that makes humans unique also makes them anxious, afraid, preoccupied with endings in ways that can interfere with living. Animals, unburdened by this knowledge, exist more fully in the present. They do not worry about dying someday. They only respond to threats that are immediate and real. But this also means they miss something essential to human experience. The awareness of death creates depth, urgency, meaning. It shapes how people value time, how they prioritize relationships, how they think about what matters. A being that cannot contemplate its own mortality cannot fully appreciate its own existence. The present moment becomes significant partly because it is limited, because there are only so many present moments before the permanent ending arrives. Some philosophers argue that humans would be happier if they could live like animals, unburdened by the knowledge of death, that the anxiety and fear generated by mortality awareness causes more suffering than it prevents, that the capacity to contemplate distant future threats is an evolutionary curse disguised as an advantage. Others insist that mortality awareness is precisely what makes humans human, that the ability to look ahead, to understand consequences, to plan for a future that includes one's own absence, is the foundation of civilization. Without awareness of death, there would be no art, no philosophy, no science, no religion. These are all attempts to create meaning or continuity or understanding in response to the knowledge that life is temporary. Whether mortality awareness is curse or gift probably depends on how it is managed. The person paralyzed by death anxiety, unable to enjoy life because of constant fear of losing it, suffers from awareness without integration. The person who acknowledges mortality but does not dwell on it constantly, who uses the knowledge to inform priorities without being controlled by it, achieves a kind of balance. But achieving that balance is difficult. The knowledge of death is not something that can be fully controlled or contained. It rises unexpectedly, triggered by illness or loss, or simply a moment of clarity about the passage of time. And when it rises, it demands attention, forces confrontation with questions that have no comfortable answers. Time running out. The experience of time changes as death approaches. For the young, time feels abundant, almost infinite. There are always more years ahead. Decisions can be deferred. Mistakes can be corrected. The future stretches so far forward that it becomes hard to imagine ever reaching its end. But as decades pass, the relationship with time shifts. The person in their 40s or 50s begins to notice that more life is behind than ahead. The future, once limitless, has become measurably finite. This awareness changes planning, priorities, the sense of what still has time to happen and what has probably passed beyond possibility. And for those in their final years, whether from old age or terminal illness, time becomes both precious and strange. Each day might be the last. Each conversation might be the final one. The present moment takes on intensity because there may not be many more present moments remaining. But this intensity coexists with a kind of weariness, a sense that the work of living has gone on long enough and that rest, even final rest, might be welcome. This changing relationship with time is one of the ways people know they are dying, even without a specific diagnosis. The body sends signals, energy decreases, appetite fades, sleep becomes either more difficult or more consuming, and the sense of future, which has always pulled people forward into plans and anticipations, begins to dissolve. There is nothing more to plan for. The future has shortened to days or weeks, and that future does not contain possibilities worth pursuing. Only the present remains, and even the present is fading. Philosophers have long debated whether time is real or illusory, whether it flows, or whether all moments exist simultaneously in some eternal present. But for the dying person, these abstract questions become irrelevant. Time is real enough, it is running out, and the question is not what time is metaphysically, but how to use what little remains. Some people in their final days become fixated on specific dates. They want to survive until a grandchild's birthday, until an anniversary, until some meaningful marker that gives the ending a shape. And sometimes, remarkably, they do. The body holds on just long enough to reach the desired date, then releases. Whether this is willpower, coincidence, or something else remains unclear. But it happens often enough to suggest that consciousness has some influence over timing, that the mind can keep the body functioning a little longer when there is a reason. Others stop caring about time entirely. The days blur together, clocks become meaningless. What matters is not when but who, the presence of specific people, the quality of remaining interactions, the sense of being accompanied rather than alone as the ending approaches. And occasionally, there are moments of timelessness, where the dying person experiences something outside the ordinary flow of sequential moments. Past and present merge. The boundary between self and others softens. Time stops feeling like something that passes and starts feeling like something that simply is. These experiences are hard to describe and harder to verify, but those who have them often report that they change how death feels. It becomes less like an ending and more like a return to something that was always there, waiting. Consciousness as fundamental. The question of what happens to consciousness after death has generated countless theories, but one possibility rarely discussed is that nothing happens because consciousness itself might be more fundamental than individual brains. What if awareness is not produced by neurons, but is instead a basic feature of reality, something that exists at all levels? And what humans experience as individual consciousness is simply one localized manifestation of something universal. This idea appears in various forms across different traditions. The Hindu concept of Atman and Brahman suggests that individual consciousness is ultimately identical with universal consciousness. Buddhist philosophy teaches that the self is an illusion, a temporary construction that obscures the fundamental emptiness, the interconnected nature of all existence. Modern panpsychism proposes that consciousness exists at every level of reality, from particles to planets, with human awareness being a particularly complex version of something much more basic. If consciousness is fundamental rather than emergent, then death does not extinguish awareness but only dissolves the boundaries that made it feel individual. The sense of being a separate self, distinct from the world and other beings, is what ends, but the awareness itself continues, no longer localized in a single body or brain, but dispersed back into the larger field from which it temporarily emerged. This vision is both comforting and unsettling. Comforting because it suggests that nothing is truly lost, that consciousness persists even when individual forms dissolve. Unsettling because the thing that most people want to preserve, their specific identity with its unique memories and relationships, is exactly what does not continue. The consciousness that survives is not personal. It does not remember who it was or recognize those it loved. It has returned to something too vast and impersonal to contain individual existence. For those seeking immortality, this is cold comfort. Yes, consciousness continues, but the self does not, and the self is what people actually care about preserving. They do not want generic awareness to persist. They want their awareness, their memories, their personality to somehow survive death intact. But if consciousness is fundamental and individual selves are temporary constructs, then that kind of personal survival becomes impossible. Still, this understanding can change how death feels. If the self is already a kind of illusion, a story the brain tells about continuity and separateness that was never quite true, then death becomes less like destruction and more like seeing through the illusion. The person was never as separate as they felt. The boundary between self and world was always permeable, always constructed rather than inherent. Death simply makes that truth undeniable. Mystics across traditions describe experiences where the sense of individual self temporarily dissolves, where they feel merged with everything, where the distinction between observer and observed collapses. These experiences are often described as blissful, liberating, more real than ordinary consciousness. And if death is similar to these experiences, if it represents a permanent release from the illusion of separateness, then perhaps it is not something to fear, but something to ultimately welcome. But these are speculations, not knowledge. No one knows what consciousness actually is, or whether it can exist independently of brains. The theories are beautiful, compelling, but ultimately unverifiable, and the person facing death, must decide whether to believe them based not on evidence, but on which understanding makes death bearable. How death is remembered? The legacy of how someone dies often shapes how they are remembered. The person who faces death with courage and grace is honored differently than the person who resists until the bitter end. The peaceful passing becomes a story told with reverence. The difficult death gets mentioned reluctantly, if at all. But this creates a subtle pressure on the dying to perform their death well, to make it easier for those who survive, to be brave when they feel terrified, to be accepting when they want to rage against the unfairness, to comfort others when they themselves desperately need comforting. The person dying is not free to simply feel what they feel and express it honestly, because they know their final days will become stories, and they want those stories to reflect well on them. This is deeply unfair. The dying person has already lost everything that death takes. They should not also have to manage how their death appears to others. They should be allowed to be messy, angry, afraid, selfish, whatever they actually feel, without worrying about whether they are dying in a way that meets expectations. But the social pressure is real. Families want the dying person to be at peace because it makes the loss easier to bear. Friends want to hear that death is being accepted gracefully because it reassures them about their own eventual mortality. Even healthcare workers, though trained to handle difficult deaths, often prefer patients who cooperate with the process rather than fighting every step. So the dying person faces a choice: be authentic and risk being remembered as difficult, bitter, unable to let go, or perform acceptance, create a narrative of peaceful transition, give everyone the good death they want to witness even if it does not match the internal reality. Some people manage to be both honest and graceful. They acknowledge fear without being consumed by it. They express grief without making others responsible for fixing it. They die in ways that honor their own truth, while also providing comfort to those who love them. But this balance is difficult to achieve, especially when pain or medication or the simple exhaustion of dying makes authentic communication nearly impossible. What might be fairer is to release the dying from any obligation to die well, to allow them to be as messy, afraid, and human as they need to be without judgment, to recognize that there is no right way to die, only the way each person actually dies, shaped by their circumstances, their personality, their level of support, the randomness of how illness or age affects them. The person who dies screaming in fear has not failed. They have simply experienced death differently than the person who slips away quietly, and both deserve equal compassion, equal respect, equal acknowledgement that they faced the hardest thing any human ever faces and got through it the only way they could. Remembering someone should not depend on how well they performed their death. It should depend on how they lived, what they contributed, how they treated others, the marks they left on the world while they were still in it. The death is only the ending, and endings are often messy. What came before is what actually mattered. The unknowable moment. The moment consciousness stops is the moment no one can describe. Everyone who has experienced it completely remains on the other side of that boundary, unable to report back, and everyone on this side can only speculate, imagine, hope, or fear based on incomplete information. What is known is what comes before: the gradual or sudden diminishment of capacity, the narrowing of focus to smaller and smaller concerns, the release of attachments that once felt essential, the shift from fighting to allowing, from clinging to releasing. What is known is what comes after: the stillness of the body, the absence of breath, the change in temperature and color that marks the transition from living to dead. The empty room that once contained a presence now contains only a form. But the moment itself, the instant when consciousness stops, when the self that was experiencing stops experiencing, remains beyond reach. Does it feel like falling asleep? Like a light switching off? Like dissolving into something larger? Or is there no feeling at all? Because feeling requires a subject to feel, and the subject has ceased to exist. Religious traditions offer their answers: the soul departing the body, the judgment that determines eternal destination, the transition to another realm where existence continues in altered form. These visions provide structure, narrative, meaning for something that otherwise resists comprehension. Science offers its answers too: the brain running out of oxygen, neurons ceasing to fire, the electrochemical processes that generate consciousness simply stopping, like a machine switched off. No soul, no afterlife, no continuation, just the end of biological function. Both sets of answers might be wrong, or both might be partially right in ways that cannot be reconciled with current understanding. The truth might be something no human language or framework can adequately describe, something that becomes clear only when directly experienced, and by then there is no way to communicate it back to those still living. This not knowing is perhaps the deepest aspect of death. Not just that it happens, but that what it actually is remains fundamentally mysterious. Every person who dies crosses a threshold that every living person must eventually cross, but no information ever returns from the other side. And so the living are left with questions that cannot be answered, fears that cannot be fully resolved, hopes that cannot be verified. They must make peace with uncertainty, with the fact that the most significant transition they will ever experience is also the one about which they can know the least. Some find this mysterious quality beautiful, the ultimate unknown, the final adventure into territory that no map describes, the one experience that remains genuinely new no matter how much is learned about everything else. Others find it terrifying, the inability to prepare, to know what is coming, to have any reliable information about what will happen when consciousness stops, the leap into absolute darkness without any assurance that there is a bottom or a landing or anything at all. But regardless of how it is felt, the mystery remains. Death keeps its secrets, and every person must eventually approach it on their own terms, with their own understanding, carrying their own mixture of fear and curiosity and resignation and hope into the unknown that waits at the end of every life. The mathematics of absence. There is a strange arithmetic to death that becomes visible only over time. Each person who dies removes not just themselves, but a unique perspective, a singular way of seeing and interpreting the world. When enough people die, entire ways of knowing disappear. The last speaker of a language takes that language into silence. The last practitioner of a craft takes those skills into oblivion. The last person who remembers a particular event takes that memory beyond the reach of anyone still living. This means that death is not just individual but cumulative. Each loss subtracts from the collective pool of human experience and knowledge. And while new people are born, bringing fresh perspectives and discoveries, they cannot replace what has been lost. The person who dies knows things no one else will ever know. They carry experiences that cannot be transferred, insights that cannot be replicated. This creates a kind of cosmic forgetting. The past becomes less vivid with each death, less accessible, less real. What was once lived experience becomes history, then legend, then myth, then finally nothing at all. The boundary between what is remembered and what is forgotten moves constantly forward, erasing earlier and earlier periods from collective consciousness. Some fight this forgetting through documentation, writing memoirs, recording oral histories, preserving artifacts and photographs. These efforts create anchors, ways to hold on to the past even as the people who lived it disappear. But documentation is imperfect. It captures facts and events but misses the texture of experience, the felt quality of being alive in a particular time and place. And even documentation eventually degrades. Paper crumbles. Digital storage becomes obsolete. Languages change until old texts become incomprehensible. The physical traces of lives slowly erode, leaving less and less evidence that those lives ever occurred. This might seem depressing, this inevitable movement toward total erasure, but it also suggests something profound about the nature of existence. If permanence is impossible, if everything eventually returns to nothing, then perhaps the value of life lies not in lasting, but in occurring. The moment matters because it happens, not because it endures. The person who dies has existed. They have experienced consciousness, however briefly. They have perceived the world, felt emotions, made choices, affected others. And while those effects will eventually fade, while even the memory of their existence will disappear, the fact that they existed at all remains true in some fundamental sense. Nothing can undo having been. This is a strange kind of immortality. Not continuation, not persistence, but the unchangeable truth of having occurred. The person who lived cannot be made to have not lived. Their existence is woven into the fabric of what has happened, and what has happened cannot be erased, only forgotten. Whether this provides any real comfort depends on how much value one places on being remembered versus simply being, but it offers at least a shift in perspective. Death ends the future, but it cannot touch the past. What was lived remains lived, even if no one is left to remember it. The body as temporary vessel. The relationship between self and body becomes strange when death approaches. For most of life, the two feel inseparable. The body is not something the self inhabits, but something the self is. Pain in the body is pain in the self. Pleasure in the body is pleasure in the self. There is no clear boundary between physical and mental experience. But terminal illness or extreme old age can create a sense of distance. The body becomes something that is failing, something that no longer responds properly to the mind's intentions. The self begins to feel like something separate, something trapped in a vessel that is breaking down. And this creates a paradoxical hope. If the self is not identical to the body, then perhaps the self can survive when the body dies. This hope appears in nearly every religious tradition. The soul as distinct from flesh, consciousness as independent of brain, the essential self as something that uses the body but is not reducible to it. These beliefs provide comfort by suggesting that the death of the body does not necessarily mean the death of everything. But the evidence from neuroscience suggests otherwise. Every aspect of self that has been studied appears to depend on specific brain structures. Damage those structures, and the self changes. Remove enough of the brain, and the self disappears. Consciousness seems to be what the brain does, not something the brain contains. And when the brain stops functioning, consciousness stops with it. This leaves the dying person in an uncomfortable position. The felt sense of being something more than mere body conflicts with the scientific evidence that everything they are depends on tissue that is dying. Which experience should they trust? The intuition that the self is somehow independent and might continue? Or the knowledge that every measurable aspect of consciousness correlates with physical brain states? Some resolve this by choosing faith over evidence. They believe what they need to believe to make death bearable, regardless of what science suggests. Others accept the materialist view and find meaning in the time they have, rather than hoping for time beyond. And some live in the uncertainty, unable to fully commit to either position. What is interesting is how often the body itself seems to know that separation is coming. The dying person sometimes reports feeling detached, as though they are observing their own decline from a distance. This might be a psychological defense mechanism, a way of coping with the unbearable, by creating space between observer and observed. Or it might be something else, some actual loosening of the connection between consciousness and flesh. Either way, the final separation does occur. The moment when consciousness stops and the body becomes an object, a thing that was once animated but is now merely matter. What happens to the consciousness in that moment remains the central mystery. Does it disperse back into the universe? Does it transition to another form? Or does it simply end like a candle flame blown out, leaving nothing behind but the memory of light? The weight of unfinished business. One of the hardest aspects of dying is the awareness of incompletion, not just projects left unfinished or goals not achieved, but relationships that need repair, truths that need to be spoken, apologies that need to be offered. The dying person sees the list of what remains undone and knows that time has run out. Some scramble to complete what they can. They reach out to estranged family members, attempt reconciliations, try to repair what was broken. These efforts sometimes succeed, bringing closure and peace in the final days. but often they come too late. The other person is not ready to forgive. The damage is too deep to heal quickly, or the dying person lacks the strength to do the work that reconciliation requires. This creates a particular kind of suffering, not physical pain but emotional agony, the knowledge that death will arrive before important things are made right. The parent who never apologized to the child, the friend who let a misunderstanding destroy a bond and never tried to fix it, the spouse who carried resentment for decades and is only now ready to release it, only to find that release requires conversations there is no longer time to have. In some traditions, deathbed confessions are encouraged, a last chance to clear the conscience before facing whatever comes next. But confession without the possibility of making amends feels hollow. Saying sorry means little if there is no opportunity to demonstrate change, to rebuild trust, to show through action that the apology is genuine. This incompletion is not just about relationships. It also includes unrealized potential. The book that was never written, the trip that was always postponed, the dream that was deferred so long it became impossible. The dying person looks back at the gap between what they intended their life to be and what it actually became, and they must find some way to make peace with that gap. Some do this through reframing. They focus on what was accomplished rather than what was missed. They remind themselves that every life contains unrealized possibilities, that no one ever does everything they hope to do. They find meaning in the choices they did make, even if those choices meant sacrificing other options. Others cannot make peace with it. They die with regret, with the bitter knowledge that they had time but did not use it well, that opportunities were available but not seized, that the life they lived was smaller than the life they could have lived. There is no resolution to this. Death does not care whether the person is ready. It arrives on its own schedule, indifferent to unfinished business, and the dying person must simply let go of whatever cannot be completed, must release the need for resolution, and accept that some things will remain forever undone. This is perhaps one of the final lessons that death teaches, that completion is not guaranteed, that life does not owe anyone enough time to finish what they started, that sometimes the work simply ends, mid-sentence, without conclusion or closure, and the survivors are left to make sense of the fragments, to honor the incomplete, to find value in what was attempted even if it was never fully achieved. Dying alone versus dying accompanied. There is a fear many people carry about dying alone, not just being physically alone in the final moments, though that is part of it, but being emotionally and existentially alone. Facing the unknowable without companionship, crossing the threshold into death without anyone to witness, to hold a hand, to offer presence in the face of ultimate absence. This fear is not irrational. Humans are social beings. Most significant experiences in life, good and bad, are shared, and death is the most significant experience of all. To face it alone feels wrong, like a violation of some deep need for connection. But the truth is more complicated, because even when surrounded by loved ones, even when the room is full of people offering comfort and support, the actual dying is done alone. No one can cross that threshold with the person who is dying. They can accompany to the edge, but they cannot continue beyond. At the final moment, every person dies by themselves. This creates a strange dynamic. The presence of others can provide enormous comfort up until that final instant. They can ease fear, reduce loneliness, make the approach to death less terrifying, but they cannot change the fundamental solitude of the moment itself. Some dying people seem to understand this and actually prefer to die when no one is watching. Hospice workers report that it is common for people to wait until family members leave the room before taking their final breath, as though death is something that must be done privately, something too intimate to share even with those who are closest. Others desperately want people present, not to change the solitude, but to bear witness to it, to know that their passing was seen, that someone was there when they transitioned from alive to dead, even if that person could not follow them beyond. The question of whether it is better to die accompanied or alone has no universal answer. It depends entirely on the person dying and what brings them comfort. Some find solace in presence, others find it intrusive. Some want their hand held until the very end. Others want to slip away quietly when no one is looking. What matters is that the dying person gets to choose as much as possible, that they are not forced into solitude if they crave company, and not forced into company if they need to be alone, that their final moments are shaped by their preferences rather than others' assumptions about what dying should look like. But even with choice, even with the perfect scenario of people present or absent according to the dying person's wishes, the fundamental aloneness remains. Death is not a shared experience. It is the one thing that absolutely cannot be done together. And that aloneness might be the final teaching, that for all the ways humans connect and depend on each other, there are some thresholds that must be crossed alone. What remains when everything ends? The candle burns down, the night deepens, and somewhere, in ways that cannot be seen or measured, one form of existence gives way to whatever comes next, or to nothing at all. The question remains open, unanswered, perhaps unanswerable. And in that openness, that fundamental uncertainty, death retains its power to make life feel both precious and strange, both meaningful and temporary, both urgently important and ultimately mysterious. What remains when everything ends is not something that can be known from this side of the boundary. The living can speculate, believe, hope, fear, but they cannot verify. The only certainty is that every consciousness that has ever existed has faced this question, has approached this threshold, has made the transition from being to whatever lies beyond being. And in that universality, there might be a kind of comfort. Death is not an aberration, not a punishment, not something that happens to a few unlucky individuals. It is the common destiny of every living thing, the richest and poorest, the most powerful and most powerless, the most celebrated and most forgotten, all face the same ending. In death, at least, there is absolute equality. This shared fate creates a bond between all who live, whether they acknowledge it or not. Every person walking down the street is terminal. Every child born is already marked for death. Every relationship formed will end in loss. This knowledge could create despair, but it can also create compassion, a recognition that everyone is struggling with the same fundamental situation, trying to create meaning in the face of certain ending. The mystery of what comes after does not diminish with time or knowledge. Science can explain how death occurs, can describe the biological processes that lead to the cessation of life, but it cannot explain where consciousness goes when those processes complete. Religion can offer detailed visions of afterlife, can describe heaven or hell or reincarnation or absorption, but it cannot prove those visions true. So the living are left with uncertainty. And perhaps that is as it should be. Perhaps the mystery serves a purpose. It keeps the question alive. It prevents death from becoming merely technical, merely biological. It preserves the sense that something profound is at stake when a consciousness ends, something that cannot be fully captured by mechanisms or doctrines. The person approaching death carries this mystery with them. They cannot know what awaits. They can only trust that billions before them have made the same journey, and billions after them will follow. They are not pioneers in some unique territory, but participants in the oldest and most universal human experience. And when the moment comes, when consciousness begins its final fade, what remains is what has always remained: the fact of having existed, the truth of having been alive, having experienced the world, having mattered to someone somewhere, in the brief time allotted. That truth cannot be erased by death. It is written into the structure of what has occurred. The dead are gone, yes, but they were here. They walked in sunlight, felt rain, knew love and loss and everything between. They asked questions, sought answers, created meaning where none existed. And though their consciousness has ended, though they no longer experience or remember, the fact that they did experience, did remember, remains true in some timeless sense. This might be the only immortality that actually exists, not continuation but the unchangeable reality of having been. Death ends the future, eliminates possibility, closes the story, but it cannot touch what has already happened. What was lived stays lived, even when there is no one left to remember it. The silence that follows death is profound, but it is not empty. It contains everything that was, everything that happened, everything that mattered in the time before silence arrived. And perhaps that is enough. Not eternal life, not cosmic justice, not reunion in another realm, just the simple, undeniable truth that consciousness arose, existed, and passed away, leaving behind the fact of its having been. The mystery continues. The question remains open, and death, in its absolute finality, points not toward answers, but toward the deeper mystery of existence itself. Why there is something rather than nothing. Why consciousness emerges at all. Why the universe bothers to create beings capable of contemplating their own ending. These questions have no answers, only the endless asking. And in that asking, in the refusal to accept simple certainties about what death means, there is a kind of life, a vitality that persists even in the face of mortality, a defiance that says, I do not know what comes after, but I will live as though it matters. I will create meaning even if meaning disappears with me. I will love even though love ends in loss. This is what remains when everything ends. Not the person who died, not their consciousness or memory or personality, but the echo of their having chosen life over despair, connection over isolation, meaning over nihilism. That choice, made by countless beings across countless lifetimes, is the thread that connects all who live and die. And when the final darkness comes, when consciousness makes its last retreat, that thread remains, silent, invisible, but somehow still there. And so, we reach the end of the map, the final threshold where life and what follows intertwine. Every concept you've heard tonight, from the weighing of the soul to the silence of the tower, from the hair-thin bridge to the spiritual wedding, reveals not how death ends us, but how the mystery of the end gives weight to every breath we take. Awareness was never about fear. It was about seeing when life is an offering, when memory is a tether, when absence becomes presence. If you've made it this far, you already understand. Looking into the abyss isn't a surrender. It's a transition from being a traveler to being an observer of the infinite. So take these reflections lightly. Hold your questions gently, and remember, once you embrace the cycle, you can never truly be lost. Thank you for listening. If this journey through the final layers of existence opened your eyes in quiet ways, subscribe, share, and keep exploring the deeper architecture of reality, the one that shapes our destiny long before the stars do. And as the night closes in, let stillness be your final advantage.